So, should paternity testing be mandatory at birth? That's what you're here to know, right? Well, this is a question that has people torn, and in my experience, when talking about it with friends, more often than not, men fall onto one side of the argument, and women onto the other. And you can take a guess as to what those sides are, but if you like what we do over here at Coffee and Popcorn, a like, share, and comment would go a long way in helping us out. So, thanks in advance. Anyway, let's get into it. I won't waste any time in letting you know what my stance is on this whole thing, but I in fact think paternity testing should be mandatory. And if you're wondering why I think this, it's simple. You see, a woman will always know that the child she gave birth to is hers. But unfortunately for men, they aren't afforded that same assurance. Regardless of how much someone might trust their partner, the fact is, a man can never be 100% sure that a child is his. But if paternity tests were standard procedure, the father would be granted the same level of certainty that comes naturally for the mother. Now, if paternity tests can't be made mandatory for any reason, guys should be able to opt into a service that requires a DNA test be done whenever a child is put forward as being theirs, regardless of whether they're married or not. As far as I know, when it comes to fatherhood and marriage in the UK, whenever a child is born, the man is automatically assumed to be the father. And while this is bound to be true in the vast majority of cases, let's not pretend that women aren't capable of cheating. It's not unheard of for a woman to cheat on her husband and potentially force or trick him into raising a child that isn't biologically his. While a lot of people say that being a dad is about more than just a biological connection, I think everyone has a right to know whether they truly fathered a child. That said, there would probably be issues if paternity tests were mandatory, perhaps leading to the tearing apart of families, which is one of the reasons that led to France making private paternity testing illegal. I was shocked to learn that private DNA testing in France wasn't allowed, and my first question was, why? But as alluded to earlier, it turns out that the main reason for this law is due to the legal and cultural framework of France, which prioritizes the protection of privacy, family integrity, and the best interests of the child. If this truly is the case, though, the number of men raising children that aren't theirs must be high enough to cause the French government concern. At least that's my thinking. It sounds wholly unfair that a man could be forced to live a lie because he's not able to get access to the truth. And while the men in France can get a paternity test done if there's a dispute about who the real father is, the sad fact is, a lot of people who get cheated on never know or suspect their partner of anything. So how would they ever be able to raise a dispute? If a man finding out that a child isn't biologically his leads to the breakdown of that particular family, so be it. After all, the cheating partner made a choice, so why shouldn't they have to deal with the consequences of that choice? When it comes to whether paternity testing should be mandatory, there are arguments both for and against it, so let's dive in. First, checking out the pros. Number 1, a child's welfare. Mandatory paternity testing would ensure that children know who their biological parents are, and if the real father is someone who's no longer in the picture, for whatever reason, at least they would know. Number 2, legal rights. Knowing who the parents are will help protect both the child and father's legal rights, which could affect any inheritance, child support, or custody. Number 3, fraud prevention. Mandatory paternity tests would help prevent cases of paternity fraud, which is when a woman falsely claims that a man is the biological father of her child. When a child's paternity is unsure because of cheating in a relationship, mandatory testing would give the supposed father peace of mind regarding his actual relationship to the child. And number 4, cuck avoidance. I think it's fair to say that most guys wouldn't want to unknowingly raise a child that isn't theirs. Knowing that you're not the real father of a child and still wanting to be in their life is one thing, but being tricked into parenthood isn't right. Now, When it comes to arguments against paternity tests being made mandatory, here's what we have. Number 1. Privacy concerns. Mandatory paternity testing raises concerns about the invasion of privacy because it requires people to do genetic testing without their consent, potentially violating their autonomy and right to control their own medical information. Number 2. Allocating resources. Implementing mandatory paternity testing on a large scale would require a lot of resources and infrastructure, which might raise questions about the allocation of public funds and priorities within healthcare and social services. And last but not least, number 3, legal and ethical considerations. Mandatory paternity testing raises legal and ethical questions about the balance between individual rights and societal interests, as well as the potential for unintended consequences and injustices. While you can't ignore people's concerns, I think that most of these points can be negated. As mentioned earlier, if people aren't comfortable with making paternity tests mandatory for everyone, I think men should be able to opt into something that requires a paternity test to be done if someone claims that they fathered a child. To lessen the costs on the system, there's no reason as to why the man can't pay to have the tests done. After all, paternity tests aren't all that expensive, considering what's on the line, so it would be money well spent. Whenever you Google anything regarding paternity tests being mandatory, you're bound to come across a thread on Mumsnet with a bunch of people talking about it. But a comment that stood out to me was by a user called 4 Green Apples, and in response to the question, should paternity testing be mandatory? She had this to say.
No. Mandatory paternity testing works on the assumption that women are liars who can't be trusted to be faithful in relationships or honest about who's fathered their children. It's frankly insulting to the majority of women to suggest this.
While most women are honest about who the father of their child is, there are some who would lie about it or are just not 100% sure. Anyway, here's another comment by Mrs. P111.
I know of one married woman who told her husband, "If you really loved me, you wouldn't need a DNA test. Others may be making accusations, but we know the truth." You can guess the outcome of that situation. Knowing years before would have been easier on everyone, but if she hadn't objected, he probably would have never have got the test done.
I understand that it can be triggering for a woman to be asked to do a DNA test, but it's also questionable as to why someone would get super defensive over it, rather than just saying, "I understand that this will give you peace of mind, so let's do it." I think guys should let it be known at the start of a relationship that they'd want to get a paternity test done if they ever had children. Being open about it early on in your relationship will let your partner know that getting the test done isn't about them or how much you trust them, but for your own peace of mind. While everyone has their thoughts and opinions on whether paternity testing should be mandatory, I think it's a man's right to know if the child he's raising is biologically his. As things are now, most men would never dream of asking their partner to do a paternity test because it implies that they don't trust them. Still, there are loads of unsuspecting guys out there who are being cheated on. And for those guys, they may very well end up raising a child that isn't theirs.